2002, Microsoft made a huge change. They had a big competitor back then. Began with an S. Sun Microsystems, and they invented something called Java. Microsoft had to respond, so they came out with something called .NET. And that's what a lot of us are still using that 18 years later. But as part of that, they took what they called active server pages and they packaged it as ASP.NET. That was the beginning of what you guys probably use a lot. In all honesty, for the first 2 or 3 years, it wasn't very useful. It didn't really have a lot of functionality. It made web pages, and you could use that newfangled language called C#. Some people used it, but it started to make some sense 3 years later in 2005. They brought out master pages and some other neat stuff like built-in navigation. They had themes. So you can make some pretty reasonable sites with it. Then in 2006, they came out with the 4 horsemen. Windows Presentation Foundation, not framework. Windows Communication Foundation. Nobody ever remembers WF. Workflow Foundation, and this stupid thing called CardSpace, which was their way to do identity. And in all honesty, 14, 18 years later, they still don't have that working as best as it could. In Azure, it's really good. Azure Active Directory, they've got all that nailed down. But in terms of like what they used to call Passport and all, they really struggle with that. Anyways, later on, they made their server controls in ASP.NET actually produce JavaScript, so it works seamlessly. A lot of magic behind the scenes. They called that Ajax. They came out with a language update called Link, which a lot of us still use today. In 2008, 10 years ago, was the first time they came out with dynamic data. Dynamic data was the first time they did scaffolding. Scaffolding means I'm going to look at a model, a bunch of C# classes that are attached to like a database in the background. I'm going to read the model and automatically generate CRUD pages, like create, R stands for something, update and delete. Read, I think. Display, something like that. Anyways, so then they went into the world of Web API, which is you had asked about, and they started making like REST and SOAP interfaces. But there hasn't really been a lot of useful updates to this in the last 10 years. And unfortunately, for a lot of you, you are still using what they call classic ASP.NET, which would be like 4 point something. And you're using web forms. You might be using MVC. MVC was originally shipped as a separate download. But the guys that went off and built MVC, ModelViewController, they were sort of the renegades at Microsoft, and they wanted to take the product in a different direction. And that's why they came out with this separate package. And they were trying to compete with things that were popular in the marketplace in the Linux world and in the JavaScript world, things that eventually became Angular, React. And the team that built, the reason I bring that up, the team that started this are the ones that eventually broke off and gave us, well, I forgot this slide. These are all the things you build with ASP.NET, but the people that broke off, they ended up working on something called vNext. And it took them 2 or 3 years to actually put together the architecture and really come up and make this work. And that was released around 2016. So that is part of ASP.NET Core. And the core implies basically that it's cross-platform. It's designed to run not only on Windows and IIS, but on lots of different platforms. And to make that happen, they completely rewrote the compiler. Why'd they have to do that? Because the compiler was designed to run on Windows. Everything was Windows, Windows, Windows. Remember that, what's his name, Ballmer? Remember that? Windows, Windows, Windows. Okay, so they needed something that could run in lots of different places. So they rewrote the compiler and came up with this thing called Roslyn. And that's behind the scenes of a lot of the things that you use today, even if you don't know it. The other thing they did is they said, we have a real problem because we designed the original .NET framework so that everybody had to install the latest .NET framework on their server. And you were sort of stuck with that version. And that became a problem, especially in production, because you ended up having certain DLLs that relied on .NET 3, but they couldn't run at 4.2 or something. And that became, it's still today a support issue. So what they did is they redesigned ASP.NET Core, so there's different versions of it right now, and you could run all of them side by side on the same machine. They can be installed as part of the website, so that one website could be running Preview 3.0, where another website's running 2.2, another one's running 2.1. So that's a good thing. And these are the things that you make with ASP NET Core. You make web APIs, which are REST and SOAP interfaces. You make MVC, which is a traditional ModelViewController type websites. And introduced about a year and a half ago this thing called Razor Pages. And Razor Pages, I'm going to show you soon, that's a simplification of MVC, a little easier to manage and maintain. And then they started this new thing, and we're going to show that by the end of the talk today. But they started this new thing, and they gave it two names, which is misleading. But the one thing they called it is Blazor. So how many have heard about Blazor? Okay, do you know what it stands for? You know how you go to those like entertainment TV shows that come on at 7 o'clock at night, and they take two famous stars and put their names together? It stands for Browser Razor. Razor is the view engine that is very popular, that's been around for a couple years. That's what you use in MVC, that's what you use in Razor Pages. So they said browser plus Razor is sort of Razor, and I don't know where the L came from. What the L? I have no idea. So anyways, the other things that you would play with if you lived in this world is Entity Framework. You might use what's called Identity Core, which is the proper way to do identity, not card space. So you need some tools. Now, some will say you could do all this from the command line. What a silly idea that would be. Or you could actually use one of Microsoft's products. I get sort of sentimental and teary when I remember Visual InterDev. How many have actually used that one? That was fun. Okay, now here's the historic part. Visual InterDev used to be able to put code. Could you use C#? No, it didn't exist yet. So you would use VB script or this thing called JS script, which is JavaScript. Okay, and what would you put the code inside of? Less than percent greater than. So you would wrap your code inside of these little markers. What do they do in Razor Pages and MVC today? You put all your code, you start it with @ sign. What's the difference? They changed the characters. But they had some interesting ideas back then, but this sort of fell out of favor. And Microsoft tried a whole bunch of mistakes like Web Matrix, Expression Web. I don't know, does anybody ever remember using those? SharePoint Designer, if you lived in that world. And then, of course, they came out with Visual Studio. So Visual Studio, especially the newest version, Visual Studio 2019, works extremely well. I highly recommend you upgrade to that. It's been completely re-architected. It is so much faster, clearer. It uses search a lot. It's just go back to your boss and say, we got to update. It's going to make us all work faster. And then look them in the eye in the meeting and say, well, we want to get our code done faster, don't we? Isn't that going to save us money? The other companion product of Visual Studio Code, which is built on top of a platform called Monaco. It is actually an Electron app, and if you don't know anything about that stuff, Google it. So I'm going to show you with Visual Studio 2019 to demo. And we're going to start with MVC. And everybody knows, or in some time has probably been exposed to MVC. Very popular model that's used in the web development marketplace. And you basically make code to store the structure of your data and your business logic. You put that in the model. and then you make separate code. In the case of Microsoft, you use a Razor page to make a view. View is how it displays the data. And then you write this thing called the controller. The controller is the thing that takes care of the interactivity. So it looks at the URL, decides what view to display. It might look at your parameters. It might do some other checking, logging, and stuff like that. So what does an MVC app look like? Well, it has a whole bunch of stuff built into it. We don't have time in our short talk today to show all of this. So let's actually go out and make a website and see if we can have some fun with that. So let's call Visual Studio, and I forget what I was working on here. That was yesterday. I'll close that one. And I'm going to just start a new Visual Studio. And this is the brand new interface to Visual Studio 2019. And the reason this is fun is they've sort of concentrated on what they think is most important to get your work done. So they show you your most recent projects on one side, and over here they have 4 big rectangles. And the first one implies that you probably should use source code control of some sort, and that most people would actually start by getting code from a repository, GitHub, whatever, Azure DevOps, and they put that up first. We're not going to do that right now, but that is a good way to do it. If you have an existing project on your local drive, you can open it that way. If you are sort of akin to using Visual Studio Code, you might open a folder. That's how a lot of people work in the Linux world. And then you can create a brand new project. So we're going to create a brand new project. We're going to make an MVC project. Now, it comes up with this interface. And one of the coolest things, it has a search box at the top. So I can type in web, it actually brings up all the web projects. So I know I want to make a web project. And then down here, Web Application 4. That seems like a dumb name. I'll call it MVC4. That seems like something I could work with. And then I'll click Create. And then it's going to ask me a couple questions. It says, do you want to use .NET Core, or are you an old-time maintenance guy doing .NET Framework? Of course, we want to do .NET Core. See, I have 3.0. We don't need to use that. We could use 2.2, and the number of templates appears based on which framework you pick. So let's have a little game here. Frameworks. There's a command called .NET, which was explained in the last session in this room. It has a parameter called list SDKs. One of my favorite things to do. That tells you all the SDKs that you've installed in your machine. And when you install Visual Studio 2019, by default, it installs 2.1. You have to specifically tell it to install 2.2, which is the latest release. I don't know why they made that decision. And if you want to try new things like Blazor, you have to jump all the way to 3.0, and you actually go to a website somewhere to download that. So those are all my SDKs. So the reason I'm showing you that, you look at those numbers, and you can see that that sort of mimics what I got there. Okay? So I'm going to use 2.2, and I'm going to make a ModelViewController. Okay? So it goes and builds a couple things. And it comes back to me. And we've done it. And we don't really care what the source code looks like. We just want to see if it runs. So I'm going to just click IIS Express and see if anything useful happens. So in the background, it's building. You see down on the bottom, the output is showing me what files it's looking at and whether it's compiling the DLLs correctly. And it comes up and it shows me a website, and the website looks like, come on, that. Okay, so if you're used to like Visual Studio 2017 or 2015, the sample templates had a lot more stuff in them. And of course, they thought that it was really important to have carousels. So in 2015 and 2017, you had to have gratuitous images that cycle back and forth using jQuery. Don't you love those things? Okay, they got rid of that. And technically, this actually uses Bootstrap 4. It's a lot cleaner layout. And you can see here that it has routing, so I can go to home privacy, I can go to home, I can go to MVC4. How about that? Okay, so that's nice that that works. So we're going to stop that. We know that the code works, and we're going to say, well, how did this thing actually come up and run? Well, it's got a bunch of views, and the views are in the home folder. So it's got an index and a privacy, and a view looks like this. It has not a lot of stuff in it. It sets a little dictionary called ViewData. ViewData is actually built into the MVC framework, and it sets it to be the home page. Okay, well, let's have some fun here. Let's make it PDN for Philly.net homepage, so at least we have some change, okay? And then it does a little learn about, stuff like that. That's good, okay. Then we have privacy. Okay, so privacy is in the home folder. Now, one of the things that bothers people about MVC is it's quite opinionated. And what I mean by that is you have to have folders called models, views, controllers. And then inside those, you have to give the names, the class names, specific names, or the whole thing doesn't work together correctly. Let's take a look at how all this is set up. So we have views. We have a view called index and one called privacy. Then we have, under controllers, we have something called the home controller. Now, the home controller has to be named home controller, where the HOME is the name of the controller, but it has to have the controller suffix on it, and it has to inherit from controller, okay? Now, by default, these things do stuff like they return a view, okay? So that's sort of cool. And that view is called privacy, that view is called this, and you can actually put something inside the view parens and make it give a specific view. You can attach data and stuff like that to it. So how does it know what the URLs are? Well, that's actually in the startup file. The startup file in ASP NET Core basically does dependency injection and does a bunch of configuration. So you are passed an interface called iConfiguration, and you make this thing called the configuration object. The configuration object does stuff. So for instance, you could ask it to add some options. And one of the options you might ask is to say, check consent needed. Does anybody know how to spell GDPR? That's a joke. Does anybody know what that is? The European privacy law thing. So if you work in a company that actually does stuff overseas, you got to know about that, because they have certain rules on a website that you have to ask for consent if you're going to actually store cookies, if you're going to store any personal information. The reason I'm mentioning that is that built into ASP.NET Core is a method that automatically does all that stuff for you, automatically pops up the little thing and checks to see whether the person selected it, and then keeps track of that for the next time they come in. So that's a useful add-on. And when you make these things, they call, whoops, don't touch the screen there. So, oh, just get out of my life here. Okay. So anyways, down here, they do this thing called use static files. Huh, what's that? Well, use static files says, I'm going to have a folder called www.root, and that's where I'm going to put my non-C# stuff. My non-C# stuff would be CSS, like site.css. It would be my JavaScript if I happen to write any, and it would be my libraries, like things like Bootstrap 4. And Bootstrap 4 is right there. Swear to God. Okay, so that's what use static files does. So that's all defined in my configuration. The other thing in the bottom of my configuration is use MVC. When you use MVC, you tell it that you want to add routes. The routes determine what you type in the URL with the slashes. And by default, it says, I'm going to use the controller name, which is home, the action name, which is /privacy, and then optionally, I can have an ID there if I want to do look at a detailed record or something like that. So if you think about this, and I actually run this website again, let's think about that. We click home privacy, that works. If I do home index, do you think that will work? Yeah, that goes to the home page, which happens to be the same thing as the home page, in which case the URL goes away, because we've said the default is equal to home index. So if you don't add a route, it automatically displays home index. That's how you get your home page. So in a nutshell, that's how MVC decides to show you stuff. If I go to my home controller, could I add a new thing here? Just to show you something interesting. Does it have to return a view? Let's call it howdy. That's a silly name, but let's try it. And let's, instead of making this an iAction result, let's make this a string. Now that's actually going to error out because view is not a string. So okay, so there's a string. So we'd have to build this again. And if we build this, should we be able to refresh this? Seems to work. Now what happens if we say howdy? Not very attractive, but it works. So the idea with ModelViewController, controllers can do all sorts of things. They can return views, which are very common. They can return strings. They can return data structures. What if it could return JSON? Then it would be called a API. We'll get to that in a few minutes. But basically, controllers live many lives. They can do lots of different things. So when you asked earlier about web APIs, my answer was MVC does APIs because all you do is you have it, basically decorate your controller and tell it to be an API controller, and it can live in the same project as your MVC, your Razor pages, and everything else. Okay, how do I get back in my menu? Well, obviously, you doing the string, I don't get the benefit of the menu and how did I get the menu in there? I have to think about that. Because when I go to privacy MVC, I don't see a menu. Well, in addition, there's this thing called ViewStart. ViewStart runs every time every page happens. And it's saying, I want every page to set their layout to _layout. Well, that might be useful because then I can have the same layout in every page. And there's a view import that says, I want every one of my page or my CS HTMLs, my Razor pages, to have these using statements so I don't have to retype them at the top of every page. Then I go into shared and say, aha, there's layout. Layout is where my menu is. And if you look down here, it has buttons, it has a nav bar, it has down here, it has a nav bar nav. So that is actually the thing here. And I'll show you the one up here is, will you please dock yourself and stop bothering me? Okay, so you see the one up here, it says ASP area. We're not gonna have time today to cover those. You are really annoying me on the bottom there. Yeah, it's hard to do this while you're talking fast. Okay, so what I wanted to show you is we have a button up there, and somewhere along here, it has a name to it. I really wanted to dock it. Oh, that's a console. You know, that was open from some demos I did yesterday. That's my problem. Here, so it was called MVC4 because it's by default, it defaults to the name of the project you're doing, and I really wanted to call this Code Camp for lack of anything better. So anyways, so hopefully I showed you how the layout is actually sort of wrapped into each of the pages by using that view start. Okay, so let's build this once again. And I can go back over here. After that rebuilds, it says it's successful, and I can refresh. And once I refresh, it should come up, and the title is now Code Camp. So it's pretty easy to make changes. So we're all cool with that, right? It's not hard to work with MVC. So we did show a little bit about the routing. I didn't get much in the model binding. We're going to skip ahead so we can look at other stuff. Other things you may want to be aware of. You can have C# code run before and after a page displays. That's called a filter. It actually filters the requests. You can have areas. If you have a very large application, you can set up areas. So you might have one that would be orders and one would be customers. And then underneath there, you would have your own model view controllers just for the orders area. So that way everything isn't in one big folder. So sort of cool stuff. Now, we're going to skip that. We don't have time for that today. So I discovered something interesting. And I did it using a very unusual technique. I actually read the documentation for, it just, you know, it's something you might consider someday. You know, everybody has their own style. Yeah. So anyways, the reason I bring all this up, the documentation for ASP.NET is actually stored here at docs.microsoft.com. Did you know that all the stuff that's in here is actually from GitHub? And the reason Microsoft had to buy GitHub is because that's where they're storing all their documentation. They were afraid they were going to lose it all. So basically, but all these pages are actually markdown files, .md, stored in GitHub. All the sample code actually comes from projects that work. Believe it or not. So they didn't just like cut and paste and put the code in here. They have this system where they actually make a running project. They sort of flag it with little comments and stuff. And the documentation actually goes out to the project and grabs the working source code. So if anybody ever updates the source code, it automatically reflects in the documentation. Very clever. And all of this has happened in the last 2 or 3 years as Microsoft has embraced open source and learned how to really get a handle on all this stuff. They have the money. Or let's just say the Azure team has the money. Yes. Anyways, what I wanted to point out, if you go all the way up to here to overview, and yet you go up, gee, gods, we are on the internet, aren't we? It's been up and down. Well, then I won't show you this. Okay. It's a shame. Okay. So I'll just tell you what was going on. So basically, if you go to the page I was going to go to, there's a section buried somewhere down there that says, oh, by the way, if you want to download all the example code, click this link. So it downloads every project that you have in their documentation for ASP NET Core, every one. And once I discovered that, I said, hey, this is a great way to learn stuff, because if we go back and we go to build J, which is my folder, but I don't think I actually installed it there. I'll know in a second. And if I go to source repos, and I did not put it in here, I used my old-fashioned way of doing things, which is I put it on my C drive. And this is how I used to work before Visual Studio 29 came out. And this thing here, ASP.Core Docs Master. This is basically all of the documentation and all of the sample files. If you downloaded that, you could sit for days on end and play with this stuff. I highly recommend that. So let's take a look at this. So let's go into ASP NET Core, and we just talked about MVC. So if I go into MVC, it explains how models work. Okay, and if you click on this thing here, that's actually a markdown file. And if we were to open a markdown file, it opens in Visual Studio Code, and Visual Studio Code actually has a little thing that views these. And of course, I always forget the keystroke to do that. I think it's that one there. Yeah, okay. So there's the documentation. Aha! That's exactly what I was reading on the website. So it downloaded all the documentation. That's interesting. Okay, so if you learn how to play with this, what you'll find out is that under ASP NET Core, they have a folder called tutorials. Aha. If I go into tutorials, there's the first MVC app. If I go into the first MVC app and go to Start MVC and go to Sample and go to ToDo completed, guess what? That's the entire thing that I was supposed to build. So if you want to tell your boss you're going through the tutorials, you download the one zip file. And then you say, well, you know, I'll go for one per day. And then basically, oh, what happened there? Wasn't supposed to do that. So anyways, let's open one of those. So this one is a tutorial that was already finished. And it has in it all of the little sample code files that you would want to run. And the reason I'm showing you that is to show that, you know, it adds like a whole bunch of stuff like models, like it adds movie descriptions, like data types and stuff like that. And if I run this baby, I'll actually see the example that I was supposed to build if I were going through the proper tutorial on the documentation. And if I click here, I actually get a movie app. Isn't this cute? So I can look at comedies, and I know that some of you weren't even born when these movies came out. But you can do silly things like do Ghost, okay, and that works. That's good. Okay, so now that we've established this pattern that we can go and run any sample we want, why don't we go out and we'll close this one down, and we'll close this one down, and we'll go back to our sample thing here, and I'll go all the way back to tutorials and say, what if I wanted to look at web APIs? So here's a web API using Swagger. Does everybody know what Swagger is? Yes. Google it. It's a great thing to have. But this will help us see how you would make an API in ASP NET Core. So I go to samples, and apparently they didn't update this, so let's go and run the swashbuckle sample. And I'm going to run this one. And again, the Visual Studio team, now led by Amanda Silver at Microsoft, she's in charge of the Visual Studio tooling. They made this a lot faster. And it amazes you sometimes when they come out with a new version that like runs 30 or 40% faster. What were they thinking 4 years ago? How did they ever make it so slow? So anyways, let's take a look at some of the code here. Now, for those of you that are astute, you'll look and say one of the folders is missing. Views, because a web API doesn't need it. However, a web API, its job is to usually get data out of some backend database or something, or some cloud service. So it's got to have models. But the way you make a web API in ASP NET Core is to make a controller. So basically, let's look at the models. There's a ToDoItem. So ToDoItem is going to be a C# class that actually defines something really complex like an ID, a name, and it is complete. Pretty exciting. Then go to controllers. Aha, there's a ToDoController. What does the ToDoController do? It has two important changes. It is going to be a class with the suffix controller, but instead of inheriting from controller, it inherits from controller base. So if there is a controller base and there's this thing called a controller, what do you think controller inherits from? Controller base. So basically, the thing that does MVC views and controllers is the same inheritance that does web APIs. The difference is controller adds things that are specific to views, like the ViewData dictionary. That doesn't exist for APIs, but it does for views, okay? So we do two things. We inherit from controller base, and then we decorate it with this thing API controller. And when we say decorate, that's technically called an annotation. And there's an app, and it says, I want to start my app at API. So then it's the name of the website /API/ whatever my controller name is, which is similar to routing that I showed you earlier. But I decorate it with API controller, and that adds extra stuff to make your APIs work. Do you know what CORS is? Cross-site scripting, all that like sort of security stuff. That's the kind of stuff that is wrapped in if you decorate it with this. So that's how you add an API. Now, this API is going to return some stuff. So we're going to look here, and you can say it's going to return like item. Okay. And since we're in a hurry, I can't show you all this stuff here, but this one's going to do an HTTP GET. It doesn't get all. It's going to return all the items. That's pretty simple. What if I run this puppy? Well, what they did is they made a little page that allows me to see the data. And I'm not sure why that didn't. Oh, okay, I know why that didn't happen. So this is designed to use something called Swagger. There's another add-on called Swashbuckle. Good things to look up. What Swagger does in the world of APIs is it automatically generates documentation and a testing framework for any API that you create. So in this case, I showed you a web API called ToDo's. It automatically generates this page. You don't have to write this. And this is really useful. So remember, it said it'll go and get all the APIs. Well, let's try it. See where it says try it out? That's pretty straightforward. And if we execute it, it comes back and it says, there's your response, a 200. And I have one API, I have one to-do built in. But what's cool down here, suppose I want to make a new one, creates a to-do item. Well, let's take a look at that. So to do that, I have to actually do a post and not a get. And then down here, I say, well, I want to try that puppy out. So let's make this 1, and let's make it. So, of course, you know, if you go to Philly.net, you get to eat Primo hoagies. So we're going to do Primo, and they're probably already here. So we'll say true. And watch what happens when I run this. I have no idea why it got upset here. But what's that? Oh, okay, I didn't see that. Well, then that's upsetting. I should pay attention to what I'm doing. So I had the exact same ID. And I bet what happened there is I need to continue because I don't care that it had and we'll try it again. Okay, so thank you for catching that. I will go down here and I will give it, just to make sure, let's make it a 2 Primo. Okay, and we'll make this true. Okay, and we'll execute that, and that seems to have worked. So what did I get back? How comes I got back a 201? Okay, if you get into the world of APIs, you have to return very specific response codes. So 400 means not found. 200 means success. 201 means success, but you created something, so I'm going to send you back a copy of what you created. And you learn, but the point is that all these tools built into ASP NET Core allow you to build this stuff and make it work. And of course, now that we have two APIs, what's going to happen when we do we have two to-dos? What's going to happen if we do a get? We get the default item and then the second one that has primo. So that's how web APIs work. So our whirlwind tour continues with, I did a web API, and incidentally, web APIs, almost always you're going to use async. Is everybody comfortable using async and await? I don't see enthusiasm. I don't see confidence. You really want to learn that, because that's how you make things run asynchronously, and that's real important if you want your websites to run faster and be able to handle huge numbers of users. Okay, and if you're still awaiting to learn how to do that, good thing to learn. All right, we're going to skip over Signal R. Don't have time to demonstrate that today, but Signal R is the way to do real-time web. And what that means is that you could have like two web pages, like a server or a client, or two clients, both talking to each other in real time. So you can build things like chat applications, or you could build a status dashboard or something that shows like stock prices. And as the stock price changes, it automatically gets broadcast out to all the clients. And it could support thousands of clients. Any idea how SignalR works in the background? Yeah, it uses WebSockets. So all that is all packaged for you, ready to go. Do that on your own. And yes, the sample applications that I showed you, there is an example of how to do SignalR. So you just go back here and you go to tutorials, and you will see that there is a SignalR, and there's a SignalR with TypeScript. Okay, so that was fun. Now, Blazor pages. Blazor pages are similar to MVC, and they're technically built on the same framework. They still do the use MVC in the startup folder, but instead of forcing you to have a models, pages, models, views, controllers folder with specific naming, what you normally do is you just make a folder called pages. And then you make folders underneath that, and the folder structure underneath pages implies the routing. Secondly, you start each Blazor page with a directive at the top called @page. If you don't add anything next to it, it means that's a default, so whatever the name of the page is going to be the route. You can also put a string after @page and tell it whether it's going to accept any IDs or any parameters. And then you can specify optionally something called a model. Now, it's interesting here. If you do @page and you don't do @model, then you can actually put your source code, your C#, underneath your HTML. And usually you start that with an @ sign. You say @functions, and then anything underneath there is C# code. But some people really get upset if you put your C# on the same page as your HTML. Are you one of those people? I know you're in here. Okay, so back in the 10, 15 years ago, Microsoft was all excited about code behind files. Well, if you want code behind files in Blazor pages, you add an @model statement. And following that is the name of a class. The class would be the C# file, the class that is actually going to have the code for that particular page. So then you have your nice separation of concerns. You still...
Sorry, why would I choose this over MVC?
Well, let me show it to you, then you decide. Because it's less work and all the cool kids are doing it. That's the same reason you know, if the cool kids are doing it, that means somebody somewhere is getting paid more. You want to be with those kids. Okay, so we're going to look for Blazor pages. Aha! So Blazor pages, you look at here and you know, just like you as a developer, sometimes your folder choices aren't ideal. under Razor Pages Start, there's a bunch of things here, and there's static, there's sample. I don't know. I'm going to choose sample, and then there's a movie, and then there's a 2.2. I think the 2.2 sounds like a good one. Try all of them until one of them works. Now, this is basically making the exact same application I showed you with MVC for a reason. So we can compare the LOE, stands for level of effort, and that's basically a measure of how much time you actually have to write code and how much time you can check sports scores or weather during the day. Okay, so not that we would ever do that. All right, so does it have a www root? You betcha. Does it have Bootstrap? You betcha. Does it have JavaScript? Yeah, it's all the same stuff. Let's go all the way down to the startup folder, or startup class. Okay, if you look at this, a lot of this is the same. It still uses static files. It still does the cookie policy, but aha, that's different. Because when we looked at MVC, we did the use MVC and we specified the route structure. This doesn't have it. The route structure is implied by the hierarchy in the pages folder. What does he mean by that? If we go to the pages folder and we expand that, you will see that there is a bunch of pages. Now there's some creates, there's some edits, so there's some data stuff going on here. But basically, some of these pages just have views, okay? And there's, we're not going to explain sections today, but I wanted to show you the code behind things. So if we go to index, index is going to actually have a form, and that form is going to have the search box that I showed you earlier on for the list of movies, and that's going to have a search string. And then down below, it's going to make a table. Now, it does some interesting things. It grabs the model. The model is passed in somewhere. Let's look up at the top. There's IndexModel. I don't know. Model must be in there somewhere. But model actually is coming from the code behind, and it's saying go get movie title, and there's a thing called display name 4. When you have an @ HTML display name 4, that's what's called a tag helper. And a tag helper are things that are written that can sort of generate magical HTML for us. And what this statement is actually doing here is saying, go to the class in the model that we got from the database and tell me the column name. And it's going to display the column name. So we don't have to hard code that in our HTML. If we go down a little further, this says display 4. Well, what's that going to show? Just the data for each row. And if you think about it, that's inside a for each loop for model movie. Well, where did model movie come from? Let's expand that. And since we have at the top here an @model statement, it's looking for something called IndexModel, and that is the name of this class. It's called IndexModel, and note that it derives from page model. Okay, so what we do down here, somewhere along the way, we have a way to create the variable movies, and that's where it gets the list of all the movies. I'm not going to read through all the code here. What I'm going to do instead, let's take and run this so I can show you that this basically looks exactly like the MVC version. So again, we have the privacy, we have the home. If we do the RP movie, we get the exact same list of boring old movies, although Ghostbusters was great in its time. So that all works. So I know what you're thinking. Why do I want to learn this instead of MVC? Well, the answer basically is a slightly simpler syntax you don't have to have the extra controllers folder. And people sort of like this code behind file idea. That's really the difference. So that's called Razor Pages, and that's actually what Microsoft recommends that you build with now. Well, I didn't really emphasize that, but everything in ASP.NET Core runs on every operating system. It runs on Linux, it runs on phones, you know, all over the place. So yes, that's the part of what you get with the core is it runs everywhere. And then what a lot of corporate shops are doing now, if they're starting any new development, they're saying, well, we might as well dive into the ASP NET Core and .NET Core, because someday we may want to run it in a Linux container under Kubernetes on Azure, or we might want to run it in some container inside of Google or AWS. So to live in that world where I can easily migrate all my stuff to the cloud, I better learn how to do cross-platform development. That's one of the things you want to take back to your shop. So this is Microsoft's tool set to enable all that. Okay.
How do you jump from page to page?
From the code.
Your logic says that it does something on.
Oh, okay. I'll show you an example of that. So when I'm doing index, so if I'm in, let me do index HTML. If I'm in index HTML, I'm going and I'm showing all this. For each of the items, we're going to create an A tag, and the A tag is going to say go to /edit and add the ID. And what does that mean when you're running? I stopped running it, I'm sorry. I'll show you real quick. So what does it mean to do that? Well, if I hover over edit, look in the lower left-hand corner. See how it says /edit/1. Well, the edit is what the A tag was designed to do. It says go to that action in the current controller, and then additionally pass in the ID. All this stuff can be done in MVC. And when I showed you in MVC, they sort of define what the route structure should be. In Pages, it's a little simpler. It's sort of implied. And anyways, so you get the idea on Razor Pages. All right, wonderful. So we got like 16 minutes until we have to eat hoagies. And you have to eat them. It's just the way it works. So, okay. So you go to this thing here if you want to download .NET Core 3.0 preview. And it's .NET 3.0 has probably been in preview for 2 or 3 months. Microsoft has a huge conference in May called Build. And at Build, I think you'll probably see the next preview of .NET Core 3. And it's going to add more functionality to what I've already shown you here. I showed you earlier how to go out and do a command line and tell you which SDKs you have installed. Okay. Then you have to do 2 additional steps. You have to do something called turn on preview mode. And that's a trick you do inside of Visual Studio. So if you want to actually work with something like Blazor, you have to do the following. You have to go up to Tools, Options. Then you go down here to Projects and Solutions, .NET Core. And there's a little checkbox there. This is in the documentation, by the way. No, it doesn't harm anything to read that. But you have to check this little box. Once you do that, it says, yeah, I'm daring enough to actually use, pre-release bits. And I want to do some testing on the next version of .NET. And that little box is what makes that light up. So that would enable me, with the addition of a NuGet package. So NuGet packages extension packages. Extensions, here's one called Blazor. Now I had to add that separately That's the thing that allows Blazor to work inside of Visual Studio. So it's an extension for Visual Studio. So what is this Blazor thing? And basically, Blazor is a way to use C# to write your front-end web pages. No JavaScript required at all. So the whole thing can be done in C#. And many Microsoft-focused programmers have been interested in this for, you know, ever since Anders Hejlsberg gave birth to C#, you know, close to 20 years ago. Now, how did they make that work? Well, there's this thing called WebAssembly. How many have studied that or read about it? I strongly recommend you do some reading about something called WebAssembly, because this is not something Microsoft invented. WebAssembly is an IEEE web standard. All of the browsers and all of the people that make languages want to use WebAssembly. WebAssembly is a way to create code, binary code that runs in a browser. And it's what they call an IL, an intermediate language. So you want to create this format. Technically, it would have the extension WASM, W-A-S-M. And you want to take and compile your stuff into WASM, and then the browser can read the WASM and display things in the DOM. The DOM in a browser is the document object model. So Microsoft is working on a version of their tools that can make something work with WebAssembly. Other companies are working with Python, or Google might be working with Dart, and they would use that language to create a bunch of binaries that can run in a browser. Now, why would you run a binary in the browser? Potentially faster, more secure. There's a bunch of reasons. Okay, could be run offline. And for those of you that have phones, which is probably all of you, you probably don't know a lot of the apps on your phone are actually web apps, even though they're like they costume as a Android app or an iPhone app. Technically, they're web apps using something called progressive web app, PWA technology, or they might use this other thing called Electron that can take a web app and actually have it appear as a mobile or a desktop app. So Microsoft wants to play in that space. They got to come up with a technology so that one of their best guys, actually he's from London, Steve Sanderson, he's the one that's working on Blazor. And he's done some really interesting work at Microsoft, but he's working with another guy named Guy DeCaza. And Microsoft made a purchase a couple years ago of a company called Xamarin. And Xamarin has this cross-platform tooling that works on Windows, Linux, Mac, and it uses something called XAML. XAML is the thing they used back in the days of WPF, Windows Presentation Format Foundation. Okay, well, Mikkel is famous for making this thing called Mono. Mono was the first way that you could take .NET code and run it on Linux. So he basically looked at all the stuff that comes out of .NET when you compile a DLL, which is technically an IL, intermediate language. He took that, and he's a smart enough guy to look at all of that, and he can map that to what WASM has in a browser. And that's what he did. So what you see when you run Blazor is you're actually running through the Mono tools that they built, and that takes your .NET DLLs and turns them into something that can display in a browser. Now, I can tell that you don't believe me that this works. So let's see if we can actually make it happen. And what we're going to do is get rid of all this nonsense. And do I have any more? I got so many of these open at one time. That seems like enough. Okay, very good. So let's start up a new Visual Studio. Now, because I have that little flag turned on, if I create a new project and I create a web project, and let's call it PDN Blazor because it's Philly.net. Okay, going to create that. Then it comes up and says, what kind of project do you want? Well, the kind of project that I want is based on my framework. Since I installed the preview of the 3.0 framework, aha, now I can do something called gRPCs. Good stuff. gRPCs is basically somewhat similar to SignalR, but it's a standard created by Google. So it's something interesting to learn. I can make background worker services, which incidentally, that kind of thing is very useful for PWAs, Progressive Web Apps. Aside from that, if I scroll down, you will see that it now has something called Blazor and Blazor Core Hosted. Let's make a Blazor. Now, if I've already learned how to make MVC and Razor pages, and I know how to make views, which have the extension CS HTML, and I know how to make controllers and on that nonsense, it'd be really cool if I could do that on the client, on the front end. Well, guess what? The pages are almost identical. So here's a page called Counter, and Counter has a little bit of HTML at the top. It's not using code behind, but it has a functions, and in here it's saying, okay, I'm going to increment my count. That's interesting. Then it has one called Fetch Data, and this sample basically makes a little table. It goes and gets a bunch of forecasts, and it does that by calling an HTTP command, which is part of the .NET Core library that it's going to bring along for the ride, and it's going to bring back a bunch of weather forecasts. And then, of course, it has a home page. So let's run this puppy. You don't believe it's going to work, do you? Not in my workshop here. Haha, it worked. Okay. So, hey, isn't this exciting? It says, hello world. It's almost semi-attractive. It's got a counter, and the counter does interaction. Aha. How did that code work? Well, let's go back and look at the counter. The counter has a current count. The current count is a local variable that's created within my context of my page. That's pretty simple. Well, if I do an on-click event on my button, it calls a method called increment count. That's pretty simple. So every time I click that, it increments count. That's pretty easy. And yes, it can fetch data and show you tabular data. So that's not bad. The thing that's fascinating is if I do an F12 and go into my developer tools and I go to my network panel. And you say, what happens if I refresh this page? Ooh, interesting. What's it got in it here? It's got something called the components assembly. It's got a CSS file, but that's where it gets interesting. It's got this thing called mono.wasm. Remember I said WASM is WebAssembly? That's the thing that Miguel de Casa's team wrote that can take a .NET DLL and turn it into a WebAssembly IL on the fly. If I can have one of that, and this thing here, the mono.js is the thing that sort of bootstraps and loads that up. If I can have that, what do you see highlighted here? That's the exact same .dll that I compiled that I'm used to running on my server, but now I'm downloading that DLL down to the client. So I'm actually sending a .NET DLL. Inside that DLL is the instructions to make buttons and counters and tables that have forecast data in it. It's also all the data types that came in my model. All that's packaged into that one DLL. Now, at this point, a lot of this is still a little experimental because you see that it's downloading a lot of the .NET framework, because it needs all that stuff to get all the work done. And I know what you're thinking. It's like, well, gee, I don't want to download that on every page. But if you were to look, you would see that all of those are 304s. What's a 304? It's already there. So I ran this page today. I ran it yesterday. All the .NET DLL stuff is already on my machine. I don't have to load it again. That's called caching. Okay. The mono.wasm, I bet that could be cached. Now let's think ahead 1 year from now. A lot of the browsers already support WebAssembly. Suppose all the browsers came out with new versions that also included a lot of the stuff you need to do Blazor. So that basically when you install the browser, it includes mono.wasm, it includes all the DLLs. That would be interesting. Then I don't have to download any of that stuff. All I have to do is send it one tiny DLL for my project, and it turns into web pages. Is this going to happen? I strongly think that it will. So, I'll show you one other cool thing you do with Blazor. Did you know that in the world of Razor, they refer to something called Razor components? So I have a page called counter. What if I went to index.chtml and got rid of this and said, put this there instead? Any of you do Angular work? I just put a component on the home page. I didn't recompile anything. I didn't change any code. I just said, let's put an instance of counter on the home page. What happens if I save this? It saves it on disk. What happens if I refresh here and go to the home page? I'm not happy. Think hard. It had already compiled the DLL and sent it down to the browser. It doesn't know that I changed the code. The view, the Razor page, is actually part of the DLL. So what do I have to do? I have to build this baby. It says succeeded. Aha! So now it said, hey, there's a new copy of the DLL, download that, and it now has a component in it called counter instead of having a survey prompt. Does that counter work? Absolutely. So you can componentize things. Interesting. Okay. So the last thing I'll show you, I don't know if this is still running or not, but it might be. I probably stopped this. Nope. Yeah. Okay. So I wanted to show you, this is the last thing I wanted to show you, and we've got about 1.5 minutes left. So when you do Blazor, there's like 4 different ways you would package things. You can package it so that the Blazor code is evaluated on a server, even though everything's all written in C#, no JavaScript. You can package it so that the code runs on the server, and then it figures out what changed in the server, the thing that updates the DOM, and it sends the changes that you need down to the browser using SignalR and WebSockets. Now, there's certain applications, I could see in-house applications that might make sense for that to work. That's one way to do it. The second way is what I just demonstrated, which is actually using client side and using WebAssembly and Mono. The third way is to build a Blazor app like I just demonstrated, but put it inside of a progressive web app. To do that, you add something called a manifest, you add a worker service so it can work offline, then you basically have a phone app that you can put in the store. And the last thing you would do is you would take the Blazor app and you would put it inside something called Electron. Electron is a way to make a web app look like it's a desktop app. And if you did that, you could probably run these things on Linux, on a Mac. And there's a popular product that you use that already uses Electron to run a web app. It's called Visual Studio Code. So the Visual Studio Code is actually a web app. And if you figure, if you look at how complex that is and all the stuff it does. Okay, so let me see if I can show you this last demo, and then I'll let you go so that you can have your primo hoagie. That's what it's going to look like, but I have to actually load the code. And I got to remember where I put it. So did I put that under code or Razor Pages movie? No, I don't see anything about pizza there. Let me go back here to see users, my name, source. Come on now, where are you here? Source are repos, and inside there I see Blazor Workshop, and then I see save points, and let's go to save point 5. How does that look? And this is going to show you a much more interesting approach, what you might really do with something like Blazor. And think about all the stuff I showed you in the last hour, 15 minutes. It has a separate project for your data models. They call this shared. So it has orders, it has pizzas, and they're all C# classes that define like things you could put on a pizza, okay? Then it has a server application, or a server project. What would a server project do? It would have an orders controller, and the orders controller would be an API. So it's going to send all the stuff about the pizzas down in JSON format to the front end. But what's the front end written in? Not jQuery, not Angular, it's written in Blazor. And it has pages like index and my order. Okay, so let's take a look at what Blazor could really look like. And this, when I first saw the demo of this app, it was like, I want to be able to build something like this. And this is actually using Entity Framework and SQL Server. Well, it's using local DB. Does that look like a desktop app? It is a web page, but it looks like a desktop app. Okay, now remember, the guy that invented all this stuff is from Britain. I do not want to buy a British pizza. I'm afraid it's going to have like bangers and mash on it. So, so I think I want to buy a Baconator because everybody loves bacon. What size do you want? We're going 16-inch, okay? What do you put on a bacon pizza? Extra bacon. And what else can we put on there? Canadian bacon. And do we need anything else? Duck sausage. I really don't know what that is, but let's do it. Okay, now, again, so Blazor knows how to do modal dialogues. It knows how to pop things up. If I click order, it pops up here. That's a very nice interface. And then it does the gratuitous boing. You have to say boing when you do that. But it comes up and like bounces a little bit. Okay. He did all this with just standard CSS. This guy's, he's on a different level than us. Okay. Now it explains here, unhandled exception. I really don't remember why this is. So did I sign? I don't know. Maybe I didn't sign. I don't know. It's not doing the identity thing. So let's not get stuck on that. It's probably some security thing. I don't feel like figuring it out. We're already 3 or 4 minutes past. So hopefully this will whet your appetite. Download ASP NET Core and start taking a look at this stuff. Read about some of the things I mentioned. This, if you're not going to an 11:30 session, please go eat. If you're going to an 11:30 session, do not eat, go to the session, and when that's over, the second lunch will be at 12:45. So we have a lunch now and another one at 12:45. And if you decide to eat twice, that's between you and your spouse and whoever else you have to answer to. So, all right, have a good day.